Hey everybody, welcome to episode 87 of the Eat for Endurance podcast. My name is Claire Schornstein. I am a board-certified sports dietitian and runner based in Santa Cruz, California. I provide virtual nutrition services to athletes of all abilities, and I host this podcast to demonstrate that there's no one-size-fits-all nutrition approach towards optimal health and performance. Today's topic is personalized hydration strategies, and I'm chatting with Colette Vartanian, a sports dietitian and the athlete care manager over at Scratch Labs. We're building on an episode I did about a year and a half ago. That was episode 52 with Andy Blow. If you want to go give it a listen, we cover all the hydration basics in there, as well as Andy's company, Precision Hydration, their sweat testing, technology, and so much more. But today, Colette and I are chatting about key hydration concepts and strategies as well. We're talking about how to identify how much fluid and sodium we need during exercise, various methods of sweat rate and sweat composition testing, how to adjust your hydration plan for different weather conditions, and so much more. This episode, by the way, is not sponsored by Scratch. I really do love their products, though, and I love connecting with my fellow dietitian colleagues. So I hope you enjoy this one. Please enjoy my discussion with dietitian Colette Vartanian about personalized nutrition. Hey, Colette, how's it going today? Welcome to the Eat for Endurance podcast.
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, especially you're not frozen now, so I'm happy. We've had a few false starts here. Before we dive into today's sports nutrition topic, which is going to be all things hydration related, I'd love to just hear a little bit about yourself as a dietitian and as an athlete.
Yeah, I have been a dietitian since 2020, but I've been working in sports since 2015. So lots of experience, lots of time in sports. I actually started as a team sport dietitian, more on the collegiate and pro side, and then found a love for working with endurance athletes and ended up at Scratch. And so since then, the last 3 years has been a whirlwind of learning so much about all the endurance disciplines, and also kind of exploring what I'm interested in. I will say it's funny, as an athlete, I always say that I am not the typical endurance athlete. I'm not an endurance athlete if I have to truly put a definition on it. As my coworkers like to say, I am a country club athlete. I love tennis and golf and Pilates and those kinds of things. That's what I kind of grew up doing. I've ridden bikes. I'm not a runner, which I always have to clarify with my athletes, is that I'm like, I love that you love what you do. There's probably no way I'm going to go on a run with you. If you see me running, something is completely wrong in the world. Something's chasing me. I'm running towards something, but it's never for enjoyment in my eyes, which is really funny. But yeah, that's me as a dietitian, and as an athlete, I love to find different ways to move my body in joyful movements. So I'm always trying different things, and I will say I'm not athletic at all. So lots of trial and error in my wheelhouse and experience of being an athlete.
Love it. Love it. And so your official title over at Scratch, so you're, the Scratch dietitian, sports dietitian and athlete care manager. Can you share a little bit about what it is that you do in that role?
Yeah. So we picked a little bit of a more broader term. They gave me the choice, actually. Do you want to be called a performance dietitian or a sports dietitian or an athlete care manager? And thinking more about what I do, it's so much more holistic than just being a dietitian. So as our athlete care manager, I am part of our customer experience team, and I provide hospitality to all of our athletes. Sometimes it is as simple as, hey, do you know someone who works at this brand? Or, hey, are you going to this race? Or do you know someone with this or that? And sometimes it's just simple requests that have nothing to do with nutrition. And sometimes it's full on nutrition counseling or coaching with these athletes. And so my role at Scratch is to provide our athletes with a community and someone to help our brand also understand what our athletes are looking for, and how they're using our products. So I spend all day with our athletes, whether it's, one-on-one calls, team talks, sometimes it's, product testing or sampling with athletes. I do a lot of education internally within our company so that I can make sure that our company also is on the right foot about the science that we talk about, as well as the outside community, whether they're in Boulder or virtually, honestly, all around the world. I've talked to athletes. So yeah, a little bit more of a holistic role. I'm not always doing sports nutrition stuff, but most of the time you can find me doing sports nutrition stuff if it's up to me.
Yeah. And you travel a lot with your athletes, right?
Yeah. So we sponsor or support athletes at so many different races. We don't get to attend every single race that we sponsor, but we try to go to a lot of the big ones, or at least I try to go to a lot of the big ones where I know I'm going to see a bunch of athletes. So typically usually go to 1 or 2 ultra running races a year, gravel or road cycling races. Have yet to go to my first crit race, and I work with a couple crit racing athletes, so that's going to be on the docket for this year. I've yet to go to a marathon. That's on the docket for this year as well. So I try to travel to see all of our athletes, and then we also go to a lot of professional expos and conferences to meet with other health professionals in the field, which has been really cool to connect with other dietitians, but also other health professionals that are serving athletes and hearing what they want to know, what they're interested in, and what their needs are. Because sadly, not yet does every team have a dietitian,
Yep.
So we're bridging that gap,
Yeah, totally. And I mean, part of the reason I wanted to have you on was, I mean, we're going to be talking a lot about hydration today. And, but one of the things you said you were really interested in and very knowledgeable about, just because of what you do, is like the greater world of like consumer product goods and all the different wearable devices and just all these things that you just have a lot of experience with now, probably, mostly as a result of your role at Scratch and other experiences. So we're going to get into all that good stuff. But yeah, first I want to get into the whole topic of personalized hydration, which is kind of what we, originally thought we were going to, or decided we were going to talk about today. And that's of course a huge topic. So we'll kind of navigate through parts of it. We don't have time for everything, but the idea here is that obviously fluid and sodium losses are extremely variable from one person to the next. We know that. And that's why in an ideal world, fluid and sodium needs are truly individualized for each athlete and also each exercise environment, because as we know, hot, cold, humid, altitude, whatever, all these things change what our needs are. But not everyone has access to either sweat sodium testing, or maybe they're not able to do a sweat rate test, even though this is a fairly simple test. I know I have had some clients who really can't get on a scale or whatever, just can't make it happen for whatever reason. So I thought as a starting point, maybe it would be helpful, just to see if maybe your athletes, you're always testing, I don't know, but if you are ever giving general fluid and sodium targets to athletes to hit during, say, an endurance training session of some kind, what would those targets be, just for any listeners who might need a starting point?
Yeah, so I will be honest, not everyone has access to sweat testing. I think it's gotten a lot easier, but I don't even have access to sweat test all my athletes, because unless they live in the Boulder area or I'm traveling with my sweat testing device, I can't test everyone. So a lot of times with athletes, we have to start with some of the foundational ideas and thoughts that we already understand about hydration and just work our way up. And we always call it me search. So you're doing a little bit of self knowledge on yourself or self experimenting. And I think that that's truly kind of where I tell a lot of athletes to start. If they don't have access, they don't want to spend the money, which I totally understand, because there's so many things you can invest in your performance. You kind of have to start picking and choosing after a certain point on what is valuable and what's not valuable. I will say, if you're an athlete who doesn't struggle with hydration, or your recovery is on point and you don't get stomach issues a lot during training or races, sometimes hydration may not be your priority for performance. You may want to invest your money on something else. But if you're someone who wants to figure it out and maybe doesn't have the funds or resources or whatever it is, I kind of give some general guidelines. And I kind of start with this place of the understanding of what's being lost in your sweat. So we lose electrolytes, obviously, but primarily sodium. We usually, with the literature, are kind of seeing around 80 to 90% of your sweat is going to be sodium loss. Primarily, it's water loss and sodium loss. And so when we're picking a product, we want to primarily focus on that sodium concentration because the other electrolytes are helpful, but they are not impactful in the moment of exercise. The other ones can be consumed pretty much at any point to help with hydration. And so understanding that, we also know that there's a wide variability, like you said. I see athletes as low as 200 milligrams per liter of sweat. So 200 milligrams of sodium lost in every liter of sweat, up to, I would say, 2,700, 3,000 is kind of like the high point that I see. And so you have this very large range. What we are seeing, though, kind of in the research is that 800 to 1,000 is where most athletes are averaging. And so if you are not sure where to start with the average, because that's where most products are going to be pointed towards, at least in their nutrition facts. That's where most of the products are going to be focused on, is that 800 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams per liter. What that translates to in supplements for most people, because none of our nutrition facts labels are measured in liters. We typically standardize sports drinks at 500 milliliters or 16-ounce servings. And so I always tell people to look at that nutrition facts label and look at the sodium. And typically, I also tell them to look at the serving size. If it's around 16 ounces, I just tell them to double it, and that will tell you where you are per liter. And that's a good place to start with, just knowing what's in your product. If you're not close to 800 yet, with doubling it and knowing that that's what it is per liter, then get your product to that 800 to 1,000 level, and then do a sweat rate test. The sweat rate test will kind of tell you, or a weigh in, weigh out will tell you a little bit more about how much you're losing with that average amount of sodium. And then what I truly do after that with testing is I usually have an athlete test with some other concentrations and see which solution they lost the least amount of weight with. And so this is how Alan actually used to test athletes before we had access to sweat testing.
Oh, interesting.
Devices, is that you're basically testing yourself on a low sodium, a moderate sodium, and then a high sodium product. Typically, I like to do it on a similar type of exercise. So if we're going to go on a bike trainer for an hour, do that with 3 different concentrations, 3 different times in the week. See which one you lost the least amount of weight with. That will be probably the formula that is closest to what you need, because you are losing less body weight, which we know is correlated to hydration status. It's not perfect, but it's close enough for most people. This is how someone can experiment on their own. And that's kind of the guidelines I give people to experiment, and even to just where to start with their hydration. From there, then we kind of keep tweaking and making more adjustments. And that's usually what I recommend. The other kind of guideline that I give, because people always ask me, well, I don't know how much fluid to drink every day.
Yeah, I was about to ask. That's always the one that we get. And then the whole concept of thirst, which I know we both, like, I know you recommend drinking on a schedule, as do I, but speaking to athletes about thirst is always part of that discussion.
Yeah. So when it comes to the how much fluid to drink, it's so variable, but a great place for me to get people to start is because a lot of my athletes will be like, well, I drink a gallon of water a day. the gallon challenge is still a thing that I talk about all the time, which is so fascinating that somehow that number has stuck with people, that they have to drink a gallon a day or 8 glasses a day. And none of that is actually, there's no evidence behind that.
Yeah.
What I typically recommend is usually starting with about half your body weight in ounces per day.
Same. Yeah. Yeah.
And this is outside of exercise. I try to limit hydration and exercise to some other metrics because I feel like people, it's really dependent on the activity and the temperature and the time of day and what you have access to and all of those things. But typically I'll say, outside of exercise, you should be drinking about half your body weight in ounces and then drinking more or less dependent on how you feel and how thirsty you are. Thirst is a very complicated conversation, and there's two kind of camps. Either you drink to thirst, or some people will say if you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these thoughts on this topic. At Scratch, we are more of a drink to thirst, I guess, camp is what I would say, or like that's the model that we kind of live by. But there's kind of an asterisk at the end. It's drink to thirst if you have the right formula in your bottle. And I think that's the condition that people don't realize. If you have the formulation that matches your sweat concentration, you can most likely be very intuitive and drink to thirst. But the problem with most athletes and why we don't recommend drinking to thirst a lot of times, or what I see with a lot of dietitians, is because people don't remember. They like basically autopilot past their intuition, and they stop listening to their bodies because there's so many other things going around, especially for newer athletes who are newer to the sport. They're trying to remember, what do I do in a race situation or a longer training situation, or there's 7 other factors they're trying to pay attention to that they forget to drink. It's not our priority a lot of the time. And so that's when I say drink to thirst is dangerous, or maybe not the best option, is for someone who maybe is not as intuitive yet with their needs while they're training. We shouldn't start with that. I still put people on a schedule. I still put expectations for them, like, because we know what your sweat rate is, or we know what your normal habits are. When it's this temperature, it should be this much, or if it's this temperature, it may be a little bit less. So we still put benchmarks, but I'm a little bit more of a drink liberally as long as you are thirsty. And there's a lot of evidence to that, because our bodies are pretty smart with fluid fluctuations and all of that. But you have to have the right stuff in your bottle. If you keep drinking to thirst and you're just drinking water while you're sweating out over 1,000 milligrams of sodium, you are going to dilute your blood plasma and therefore put you at a risk for hyponatremia. So there's always an asterisk at the end of, you can drink to thirst, but it has to be with something that matches what is in your sweat or close to it. At least during exercise. I think that all other times of the day, we can probably drink to thirst a lot more easily. But yeah, that's kind of the camp that we live in, is that we believe that if you have the right stuff in your bottle, that you can drink to thirst and your body will respond to it really well. But it takes time for athletes to get intuitive, especially if it's a new sport or you're doing it in an environment that you've never really done it before. It can change things for sure.
And it definitely helps. I mean, the carbs and the sodium that you're consuming in your bottle also stimulate thirst. So it's going to make you more likely to drink more, which is helpful. And I think when it comes to thirst more generally, if we're just talking general, like every day, I mean, like with challenges just eating enough, I think people are so distracted that, you know, they probably are thirsty, but they're not actually hearing the signal of their body or paying attention to it because they're so like zoned into whatever it is that they're doing. So like with hunger, right? So it's really easy to override those signals and not be as intuitive with these things if you're not paying attention, you're not listening. So I think with all these things, we just have to actually pay attention.
Yeah, and I think most people know themselves really well, or they work with someone that can help them figure out how they respond to certain habits. And I think
Yeah.
that's why sometimes I really do feel like it's really helpful for people to work with dietitians, because sometimes we're not giving really life-changing advice. It's all really like, I worked with someone today and they were like, all of this stuff is really common sense. And I was like,
Yes, I
yeah,
hear that all the time.
it's not life changing. I don't have a secret sauce that I give
Yeah.
you. Like, I don't have anything. What I truly help someone figure out is what logistics and what mode of fueling and hydration works best for them. And I think that that's one of the biggest misconceptions of our field, is that we just give out like fuel and hydration plans, and like there's this magic science that, like, if I tell you 20 grams, it's going to respond exactly the same way. But what I truly tell people I do is I give you the tools and I give you the knowledge and I help you understand more about yourself. And especially with hydration, that's a lot of the case, because hydration changes way more than fueling does, because your fueling habits and your tolerances are very predictable compared to the hydration, because the factors for hydration change so much, that if I can learn kind of what your habits are, if you're intuitive or not, what motivates you, what are you thinking about while you're training, what are, you know, your biggest challenges, I can help build a hydration plan or a focus for you that makes more sense for your lifestyle. So there may be, you know, an athlete who's like, you know, I do feel thirsty, I just forget to do that. I'm like, okay, can we log it into your watch to beep every 15 minutes to remind you, hey, maybe it's time to take a sip? Or is it that, you know, we switch you to a model where you wear a, you know, a camelback backpack and the nozzle's right by your mouth, because there's no way you're going to reach into your bike cage to grab it. So sometimes it's like, how can I help you be more successful? Because a lot of this stuff is not difficult once you figure it out, but a lot of people have struggled just figuring it out on their own.
Yeah. And I think it's also easy to get confused because, and this kind of segues into my next question, because let's say now we get into testing stuff, right? So let's say someone does a sweat test, a sweat rate test, and they get, you know, they lose however many ounces an hour. It's the, okay, well, now what? What do I do with that? Right. And, you know, how many times did you do the sweat test, and how do you adjust based on different weather conditions? Or what if someone's training for a race, you know, a spring race that's going to be warm, and they have no access to training somewhere warm where they are, so they're doing the sweat test in the cold. I mean, they're just like all these variables. So I'm really curious how, you know, how you can kind of guide my listeners in terms of, okay, let's say you do this very simple at-home sweat test. Now what?
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Yeah. So the one interesting thing about sodium sweat concentration is that it's a genetic number. So the amount of sodium in your bottle is always going to be the same. It's the volume that changes, which makes it a little bit less confusing for people, because now you're not mixing 70 different potions up. You are mixing one thing, and it may be more concentrated if you're drinking less volume, and it may be less concentrated if you're drinking more. And it kind of depends on, you know, that for some people. So I always tell people the times where things are going to change is mostly temperature dependent. The concentration in your bottle, so the amount of sodium probably won't change, but how much of it you're drinking per hour is going to change. So we may need to change some of those habits. But the sweat rate comp piece will tell someone more about how much they should be drinking, whereas the sodium concentration will tell them what should be in their bottle. Once you know what should be in your bottle, whether you do the testing the me search way, or you do it through a wearable device or working with a practitioner, that'll stay the same. So let's say, for example, we have an athlete. I know that they swell 1,200 milligrams of sodium per liter. That tells me that in their 16-ounce bottles, they should have somewhere around 600 milligrams of sodium. That's not going to change. But
Yeah.
now let's say they're training for a winter. They're training in the winter for, let's say, I guess I think about it like living in Colorado. Most of us are training in cold right now, but then they're going and racing in places like Puerto Rico or Florida or somewhere warm right now. And how do you make that adjustment? Well, in the wintertime in Colorado, they're probably drinking maybe somewhere like 10 to 16 ounces an hour. But in the heat, we kind of go back based off of what they were previously doing. Or I usually say that most people, from what I've noticed, drink somewhere like 8 to 10 ounces more per hour when it gets hotter. I think 16 ounces is a very standard place. And then I go from there and I'll go, okay, so if you're typically in the heat drinking 16 ounces, then in the cold, you're probably drinking somewhere like 8 to 10. Or if it's the opposite, like in the cold, I drink 16 ounces. In the heat, you're probably drinking like 24 to 28 ounces.
And that's all per hour, ounces per hour.
And we can do some sweat rate testing. I think that can be helpful, but I always just kind of go off of people's habits and work with them to figure out you will always be drinking less in the cold. It's like a non-negotiable that most people know. Like at some point you start realizing it. I'm never going to drink as much. So am I getting also my carbs from my bottle? Do I have to change some of that logistic too? Like I have one athlete who's going to be training that I've been working with, and I just walk through this with him. I always say, like, you're probably going to drink about half of what you typically drink in the wintertime. It's pretty normal unless you're a regimented drinker and you're like, I make sure I get through a bottle, but thirst goes away in the cold. It's inevitable. So we make some of those recommendations. I always just think that the volume is going to change, and we sometimes need to do a couple sweat rate tests. Sometimes if someone doesn't have access to warmer weather, I'll have them do an indoor workout because it's pretty close. If you don't have access to leave a cold temperature environment, just do a test at least indoors, because that'll be closer to the warmth. The other thing you have to like factor in is humidity. I think that's the one piece that people don't always factor in, because it can be 70 with high humidity and it could feel like the same as if you are running in 115 degree dry weather. And you will be sweating probably more and not noticing it. So paying attention to what climate you are going to be racing or training in, or what your demands are, you're always going to need more when it's more humid, because the sweat is not evaporating off of you properly.
And then you're not able to cool yourself as much, right?
The body temperature thing is probably the biggest reason why we care about hydration. And I don't even think that people are really aware of that piece of it. Hydration helps move nutrition through our body. It helps keep us hydrated. But the whole point of hydration is to maintain core body temperature. And so whatever you can do to do that is going to be helpful. And in higher temperature situations, you're probably going to be drinking more, and you need to account that you're going to be drinking more. And it's so hard because I wish I could give more concrete facts to, like, if you're in this exact scenario, but everyone's so different.
I know.
And that's why I think that we're moving towards this world of hydration personalization, is because we're finally realizing we've dialed in the fueling, we've dialed in our equipment, and we have access to all of those things. And now there's been this huge question mark around hydration for so many athletes. Like, this has become truly a very hot topic. I almost feel like 2 years ago when I started at scratch, it was always the CGMs. We were always talking about continuous glucose monitors and blood sugars. And it's really, the conversation has moved completely away from that now, and it's all about hydration. So
absolutely. For sure.
I feel like I wish I could give way more but it's always, for me as a practitioner, I'm always like, it depends.
I know. It's like my favorite thing to say. I know. I hate saying it.
I hate saying
That's the
it.
answer of every dietitian.
I'm sorry to everyone listening to this, and I feel like maybe I'm not being very helpful, but it's so much of a it depends thing. And there's what I really have learned in the industry is that like, although a lot of people work in the sports and athletic environment, hydration science is not something that is taught.
It's not. And it's something, like when I talked to Andy Blow over at Precision, gosh, I think it was like a year and a half ago now. And even since then, my own understanding of hydration has come like so far. But I remember talking to him and still trying to like fully grasp some of these concepts. Like, it's highly confusing, I know, for many of my clients, and even as a sports dietitian earlier in my career, I was also so, and it's obviously still being studied, and we're learning new things all the time. So that's the other piece of it. But I guess what I'm trying to also get at, I want to drill down a little further into this. Like, if someone, say, does a sweat test and they learn that they lose, I don't know, 24 ounces an hour. What I always tell people is, we're not trying to replace 100% of that. That's not our goal here. But then they're like, okay, well, how much do I drink? And that's where it's like, it depends. What's the weather? And that's where we get into that kind of thing. And then it also depends, are you a very heavy sweater? Like, are you losing 2 liters an hour? Or are you losing 16 ounces an hour? And that will also, so there's a lot of fluctuation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this in terms of what key takeaways we can have here. But I'm generally telling people, like, if you're losing, say, less than a liter an hour, then maybe we're in the 50 to 75%, or maybe we're 75% replacement, like roughly. Again, obviously you have to practice all this and see what works. And then if you're a liter or above, like, at a certain point, there's only so much we can tolerate, especially for prolonged periods of time. So we know you can tolerate a liter per hour, but like, how far can you really go up? You can't go that far up,
I guess my understanding and what I've learned over the times of understanding hydration is that most people can replace about 75% of what they lose. That 3/4 is about enough, because our bodies kind of don't want us to go 100%, because realistically, what our losses are going to change so much that 3/4 of what we're losing is enough. So if you lose 20 ounces, then you probably should be replacing about 15 and seeing how you do. And if you are, I think that a couple things people can pay attention to while they're training, when they're trying to figure out what's happening with their hydration, is, do I feel like sloshy in my stomach? Am I still thirsty? I also typically ask them, I guess, how do I phrase this? I lost my complete train of thought. Are you thirsty?
Well, let's go into that though. Like, okay, let's say someone is sloshy. What would you say to them? Because that comes up all the time.
You are either drinking too quickly, like you're chugging your beverages and you need to space them out, or you're drinking too much. So that's the first thing I ask people. I'm like, do you feel sloshy? If they say yes, then I say, okay, you need to space your fluid out a little bit more, because you are maybe chugging and that's not retaining well into your system. That's the first thing I have to teach people, is that chugging does not mean that it's going to go down better or 100%. Chugging usually doesn't help with absorption. So that's the first thing, is, are you sloshy? Are you getting side stitches or any of that? That also usually means you're doing it too quickly. And then, are you still thirsty? That typically means that they're just still not getting enough. And when you think about thirst, I always say, like, do you need to pay attention? Is there more electrolytes that are needed, or do you need more actual volume? And so some of those can play a role in it. I'll also ask people about their thirst in altitude. So if any of our athletes are training in altitude, I have to give disclaimers that you're probably not going to be thirsty at all. Hunger and thirst go away when you're at
Yeah.
altitude. And so those are the times I prompt a little bit more. And then we typically kind of ask what their behaviors are afterwards. Are they reaching straight for more fluids? Are they going to the bathroom? How often are they going to the bathroom when they're exercising? Also tells us a little bit. And sometimes I even ask them, like, okay, what was the color of your urine after your workout or before your workout? They're not perfect telltale signs, but typically with urine, I don't think it's perfect, but I will say that if you are completely clear, you've overdone the liquid with not enough electrolytes, one or the other. And then if you're too dark, it's typically not enough fluids or too many electrolytes.
Yeah.
So paying attention to all those things, collecting all that data and bringing it back for us to kind of go back to the drawing board is always really helpful. Those are usually the questions I'm asking most of my athletes when they're kind of experimenting on their own.
Yeah.
Amount of urination is also just like a very telltale sign of if someone's hydration practices on a training session is working well or not. If you're urinating more than once or twice in, like, I would say a 6-hour ride or run, I feel like that's not the norm that I'm seeing. I wouldn't say that it's wrong, but it's probably something to pay attention to, is your frequency of urination. And that might be different for everyone, but also just like know what your standard is. And if you're doing more or less than that, we also want to assess that piece of it.
Yeah. And I mean, in that case, it's more like, well, it could be just you're consuming too much volume, but it also could be you're not consuming enough sodium to hang on to what you're drinking, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would definitely say that. And I think that when we were talking about that max side, I've typically seen from most of the practitioners that I've worked with and the athletes that I've worked with, that usually more than a liter most people can. Like liter and a half. Like,
yeah.
And usually you have to be a large bodied person to be able to take that much. So being more precise if you're having a hard time catching up with your fluid losses is to focus on your electrolytes. If you're someone who's a heavy sweater, we're probably going to focus more on making sure you have the right amount of electrolytes and going from there, rather than forcing you to drink the exact amount that you're losing. Because I have people who lose, and you've probably seen it too, 40 to 60 ounces per hour.
Yes.
And you're like, how do I even get them to that point? Because that's like, 2 liters of fluid. There's no way someone can drink that in an hour and be comfortable. It's more about the comfort piece to me than anything. If you were sitting on your sofa or at your desk, you could probably get away with drinking 2 liters an hour. But when you're moving, it is just so much harder to get that liquid in.
Hey guys, just a quick break for a few short announcements. First, my on-demand course library on Teachable is up and running, and I have many different resources on there for you to check out. As I've mentioned before in this podcast, my course, Peak Performance for Endurance Athletes, is available for purchase now. It's a 7-part course with 8 hours of video content and 17 downloads. You can even listen to it podcast style if you want, and it teaches you all about how to nail your everyday nutrition while living your busy life, how to fuel and hydrate yourself before, during, and after training and racing, how to create a personalized fueling and hydration plan that is specific to your sport, how to train the gut, and how to navigate the world of performance supplements and determine if any are right for you. So head on over to my show notes, my website, or my Instagram profile to grab the course link. If you don't need or want the full course, I'm also selling several of the downloads from the course separately on Teachable. They're essentially miniature ebooks on a variety of different topics, and they're very cheap, only $5 to $10 each, or you can buy them at a discounted rate in a bundle. And lastly, I do have one-to-one nutrition coaching spots available for April. So if you are interested, please let me know. You can fill out a new client inquiry form and schedule a free 10-minute call on my website if you would like. All right, let's get back to the show. Yeah, and there are lots of different angles to this because, number one, of course, you can train your gut to tolerate more volume, and that's encouraged. Like training the gut is incredibly important. It's not just something we're doing for the calorie piece. It's what we're doing also for the volume of fluid. Getting that sodium dialed in so that, you know, you're meeting your needs in that sense. But yeah, there's a lot to do there. But I think especially when it comes to really heavy sweaters, I think that's a great kind of lead into the whole concept of hyperhydration or preloading, whatever you want to call it. Not prehydration. I know it's separate from like just taking in a little Gatorade or Scratch or whatever you're drinking, but like a very intentional strategy of optimizing your hydration status, which, you know, I talk to clients about all the time. Not everyone knows about it, but let's chat about when hyperhydration is appropriate and how to go about doing it. Because I know from what I've seen, I'm usually recommending it like the night before and the morning of. And I actually heard you on Bob and Dina's podcast talk about it, and the timing was a little different than what I usually recommend, in part from what I learned from Andy, but just looking in. I'm really curious about that because you're recommending, I'm jumping ahead here, but you're recommending hyperhydration really close to the start of exercise versus say like finishing your bottle 90 minutes before, which is kind of more where I've been functioning. So yeah, let's back up from it. I've got ahead of myself. So when is hyperhydration? What is it? When is it recommended? And we can talk about how to execute it.
So hyperhydrating, I guess people use two different terms when it comes to this hydration prior to an event. It's either preloading or hyperhydration. Everyone has different definitions to it, but the way that I view it is your hyperhydration is going to happen pretty much throughout the days prepping for your event. So you're basically just increasing hydration needs. And that doesn't mean increasing just fluid, which is what I have to be very clear with people, is because I'll say, are you hydrating or hyperhydrating before your events? And they'll say, yes, I'm drinking more water. That doesn't always mean anything. Usually what I recommend is the night before or the morning of, you should be having some kind of electrolyte loaded beverage. So whether it is a sports drink or maybe it is a salty meal. So we a lot of the times recommend maybe it's you have a bowl of soup with your meal the night before, because soups and liquids like that tend to have high sodium concentrations. And so you don't always have to drink a sports drink, but if you salt your meal well, or you have a soup or something salty with your food, you will tend to hold on to more of that hydration and be closer to 100%, I would say, before you go to bed. I do that the night before and the morning of. For most of my athletes, I usually tell them the minute you wake up, you should probably have a bottle already mixed next to your bed. Pick it up and start sipping. You don't have to chug it. You don't have to drink all of it, but start drinking and reminding yourself to get more fluid in. So that's typically the camp that I live in just getting people started on being better about hydration, especially close to a hot event. But then there's this concept of preloading, which is in which we give a high amount of sodium within a certain amount of time before a race to increase plasma volume in order to increase performance. So these are like two very different concepts. And I would say the latter is something that we practice with more. I would say if you're an athlete who has dialed in a bunch of other pieces of their training and they're looking for that 1% difference, this is one of the things that I would start incorporating. But if you have not really gotten a dialed in version of all your other stuff, like your breakfast or your hydration leading up or your pre-rituals, then the preloading thing is way too far ahead for you. It's not going to make the gains that you want to see. But if you're working as an athlete and you're like, I've gotten sweat tested, I already know what's in my sweat, I've already dialed in my fueling plan, I already do the caffeine thing, I already have all these pieces, and I'm just looking for that next thing, this is where I typically take athletes. It's not always just for the elites, but I think that it's definitely a more advanced concept.
Yeah.
But with that, you basically want to, I usually say between the time of warm up and start is when you're going to try to get that preloading in. And typically it's somewhere between 8 to 10 ounces. I don't try to do a very large bottle because usually the time between warm up and start is not very long. And if you drink too much fluid, you will have to go pee.
Yeah.
We typically do something as salty as about, I would say 15 to 1700 milligrams of sodium per liter. That doesn't matter what your sweat sodium concentration is. That's typically what the load amount that we do is, because it's almost as salty as your blood is. And so the ability for fluid to move will be a lot more effective. And typically for endurance athletes, we pair that with a bunch of carbs. And so most people are very comfortable with the start carb concept. So we'll put anywhere from 30 to 75 grams of carbs in a bottle, depending on the athlete and their needs, and what they typically consume. So we'll do the carb and the salt in one bottle, and they will consume that. It increases their plasma volume, which then increases that performance for them and the cardiac output that they're able to put through the first bit of the race. So there is a performance advantage to it. It's not a concept that I would say everybody needs to do. It's definitely more of an advanced concept. But the prehydration, the drinking something the night before and the morning of, is something that everyone should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like when you're talking about like the way that you're doing it really close to the start, is that basically replacing that final fuel? Like that's like, cause often okay. So yes, you're nodding. Cause often, we're like, for, let's say it's a marathon runner, we're like, okay, great. And then the 5 to 15 minutes before you start, like have your your gel with whatever, so it's essentially like killing two birds with one stone and knocking out that hydration and fueling piece. That's really interesting.
A liquid is a lot easier for most people to get down in that second. Sometimes getting them to get some chews down or gel, like with nervous gut, like it's very, very normal for people to not always want that. And sometimes sipping on a liquid is just a lot easier. And you kill two birds with one stone. I think it's really nice. I'll typically tell people to get like a throwaway water bottle, whether it's a plastic one or an old one that they don't want, because most likely you're never going to see that bottle again unless you have someone on the sideline that's able to give it to you. You don't use your most expensive bottle for your start bottle. It's usually not the best idea, but it definitely does kill two birds with one stone if you do that, and it's something that you want to start incorporating in.
So when you're working on the night before, let's say, you're not recommending a specific amount, because like interesting. Yeah, so because like as I said, the approach that I've been taking, so that fit like say 1500-ish milligrams per liter, or let's say 750 milligrams for 16 ounces or so. I often recommend that as like, taking that with your dinner or something like that. And then in the morning, some version, although in the morning, often with many of my athletes, we're doing some sort of like baby step version of like the true hyperhydration. So it's more like, hey, have your Scratch or Tailwind or Gatorade or whatever it is with, at these multiple 8 ounces here and 8 ounces there. And I personally actually haven't tried the strategy where I'm doing like a liquid right before versus a solid, and I'm really curious. I actually would totally love to try that myself. Is that something? Actually, no. You don't do endurance events, so you haven't tried that yourself.
No, I give them to people all the time, but I never really have to do them. I will say I've never done a race, so I would not personally know, but I know that most athletes, we work with them on that, and I think that with that, the night before and stuff, I try like. I guess it depends on the athlete too. I can give specific recommendations, but I try to reduce some of that stress of the night before by like having that regimen, because they have so many other things that they're being regimented about that I'm like, this won't, the night before, especially for me, is like get enough in that you are quenching your thirst, that you are going to bed well hydrated. You don't want to do too much either, because then you'll wake up throughout the night and have to go pee.
Yeah.
So make sure you're getting enough electrolytes to hold on to that, and don't drink tons of fluid, but drink to
Sure.
thirst.
Yeah.
I usually try to really encourage people to incorporate more of the electrolytes into their meals because it's a lot
same.
easier. So have a cup of noodle as a snack, maybe before bed. Maybe it is have a bowl of miso soup if you're out around and you're like, I don't have anything salty. Canned soup, also great. Like, all of those things are really salty and they really help. Or add soy sauce, salt your food, have a salty snack. Like, all of those things are going to drive hydration to be better. I typically leave some of the regimen for the morning of for them, just because it's just it's so many things to keep track of.
Totally.
And I really try to encourage people to be intuitive and to kind of go based off of what their habits are. So you kind of really do live in that camp at Scratch of you are your own best experiment, and we'll give you some guidelines, and then you figure out what works best for you. And real foods are honestly sometimes better than some of the supplements that we have to incorporate. And honestly, it just gets really tiring. If you race a lot, how much of the same stuff can you have?
Yes.
I don't know, but there are some people, I have athletes who are like, I eat the same breakfast every single day. And I'm like,
yeah, same.
How do you do that? I wish I was that person. I hyperfixate for like 2 weeks on something, and then I move on. My current hyperfixation is pancakes for breakfast. So,
ooh, yum.
But then next week it might be a bagel and cream cheese.
Sure.
And so I guess I counsel and I work with my athletes the way that I am, which is not type A at all. So if you're looking for a type A dietitian, it's not me.
I'd say like the majority of dietitians are very type A, so that's refreshing to.
I always say, I'm like, if you are someone who kind of wants some guidelines, but then I work with some athletes who are like, they need that, and I can give that to them. But it's really funny that I am not type A at all, and so I can give you a good place to start, and then I'm like, listen to yourself. And they're like, I'm used to someone telling me exactly what to do, and I'm like, you gotta, I don't know. I try to encourage people. I always tell them, I'm like, I'm not your mom, I'm not your coach, I am not, always going to be there, your partner, or any of that stuff. So I'm going to give you the skills so that you can figure it out when I'm not there. But I also work with athletes in a very different capacity than most people do. Athletes don't pay to work with me.
And you work with mostly elite athletes, right?
For the most
like they're sponsored, or
I will work with our elites, but I work with a lot of our consumers as well. And for them, I think it's just very different levels of education and knowledge. And so with the elites, we've pretty much dialed in everything, and so it's small tweaks. So there isn't a whole regimen that we have to revamp. With more of my consumers and recreational athletes, they don't also need as much of that. And if they do, then we kind of work through some of the guidelines. But it's so interesting to me. Everyone practices so differently. And I think that's one thing I always tell my athletes, especially a lot of them after meeting with me once, they're like, I'm ready to work with a dietitian. I want to work with someone. I want to spend the time getting better. And I refer people out because I don't, typically see people for more than 1 or 2 times to get them dialed in, unless there is some kind of a relationship there. But honestly, I really recommend people working closely with someone. And in that case, then, I always tell people, I'm like, find a dietitian that aligns with what you're looking for. The same way we look for doctors and dentists and nail people and all the things, hair stylists, you go until you find the right person, right? You interview them, you figure out what you're looking for. Every dietitian is different. I guess that's what my one advice to a lot of my athletes that, probably are listening here, and even to practitioners and stuff. I'm like, we're no different than any other profession. Like, find the person that speaks to what you're looking for, and what
Totally.
makes sense for you. I'm not everybody's cup of tea, and I don't
Yep.
want to be
No one
everybody's
is. No,
cup of tea,
I'm not either.
you know? And I think that's
Yeah,
the cool
exactly.
thing, and that's it's the same with coaches. You're gonna
Yeah.
find someone who works well with you and understands what your needs are. But I will say that with my athletes, I give them a lot of autonomy, and a lot of putting it back on them.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think it comes from working in collegiate sports, truly, because you don't have the time to.
Sure. Of course.
You don't have the time to do it.
Yeah.
And you're teaching a lot of foundational work at that point. And they need
Yeah.
autonomy, because if you let them, they'll let you take care of them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And with all this stuff, you know, whether it's a I mean, I think with hyperhydration specifically, because, or even any of the preloading strategies, it's like, just, I always emphasize these things, but practicing this stuff, because there are potential side effects. You might get GI stuff from hyperhydrating, and just testing that out and making sure you're trying it. You're not waiting till race day to test that strategy out, test for long runs and all of that is so important.
Yeah.
So I just want to remind people to do that.
The one big thing about hyperhydrating, like that large dose of sodium right before the race, is make sure you are warmed up before you start consuming that. Because if you are not well warmed up and you are still cold, you will have to go to the bathroom right away. You will have to pee it out. It does not retain as well when you are cold. So the one thing I do recommend to people is, if you are going to practice a hyperhydration strategy prior to a race, first of all, test it before you do it. You should be testing stuff at least 2 to 3 times before you implement it in a race, in my opinion. One time is not enough. You need it at least twice, 3 times, ideally in a couple different environments or different heart rates, at least, to make sure that your body can handle something. But also, what your body responds to things when it's cold very differently than when it's hot. So especially with hydration, it does not retain as well when we're cold. So that large amount of salt will not increase plasma volume when you are cold, because your blood vessels are constricting because of the temperature. So it will not dilate that blood vessel to add more volume. It'll just want to push it straight out and make you have to go to the bathroom and pee. So
what if you don't do a warm-up? Like me, if I'm doing an ultra or some other long event, like, I'm just standing around and then the race starts. I'm like, cool, now I'm just doing my warm-up at the start of this race.
Yeah, and that
maybe it's not for me.
Strategy or something to think about when you're thinking about the logistics around hydration.
Yeah.
A lot of hydration is primarily logistics, because there's only one variable we're trying to figure out. The rest is really the logistics on how are you going to hydrate and in what ways. And so if you're someone who's like, this is a middle of the night start and it's cold right now, and I'm not going to warm up, maybe it is that 10 minutes in is when you have your hyperhydration, because you're warmed up at that point and not 10 minutes before. The strategy can change. And again, it depends what works for you. What is the situation that you're in? So for sure, paying attention to
I want to spend some time talking about the various ways of testing sodium. Because this is another one that can be very confusing. I know you use Precision's technology. That's the one that I recommend if it's available, but not everyone can get to a testing center, unfortunately. But you know, there are the wearable devices like Nix and H Drop. I haven't tried those personally. There's the mail-in sweat patch like Levelin, or I don't know if Gatorade still has theirs, but I think I've used theirs once. And then of course the Precision one, where you like go to a testing center and you do the test at rest. So maybe you can walk us through these different products, and I don't know if there are any others that you want to mention, what they're trying to accomplish, because some of them are not just measuring sodium, like some of them are measuring other things. How accurate they are, and anything else we should know about these tests?
So with sweat testing devices, I think there's been a lot that kind of have moved across in the market. the more laboratory style testing would be something like the precision hydration. So the precision hydration device was actually developed originally as a product to diagnose cystic fibrosis. Then it was then discovered that it could be used in athletic settings. And so now that is probably what I would say the most, I guess, in my eyes, the gold standard. The gold standard is a full body washdown. If anybody has seen this, go Google it. It is a very interesting test, but it is very invasive.
Not practical.
So nobody does them. It's a really funny test though. So if anyone's curious, like, do look into it, because when we're in school, they teach us that is the true gold standard. I find the precision to be my gold standard because I know what I'm looking for as far as the variables are. And I'm primarily, when I'm working with athletes, mainly looking for sodium concentration. I'm looking for that electrolyte concentration more than some of the stuff that other sweat testing devices offer. So that device only measures sweat sodium concentration. So if you're looking for sweat rate with that device, you also have to do individual testing, which you only requires a scale to test that component and some exercise. That test is done at rest. Then there's a couple other stuff that I've seen kind of in the field that's been done. So there's a company called MX3 that works a lot more in the tactical space that does the sodium concentration very similarly to the precision hydration, but they require exercise to collect that sweat sample. And there's some other ways, like the original protocols were sweat patches that you would make athletes wear, and then you'd rip them off and like you have to squeegee them into things. Like there's so many different ways. There's some other devices that test that way. But for the typical consumer, what we're seeing more is you either go to somewhere where someone can test you with the precision hydration device. You're going to get a wearable like the Nix or the H-Drop. There's also a company called Sweat ID that I've seen that does this. And there's a couple other smaller companies that are up and coming. And I think that this is where we're going to see a lot of movement in the technology space for sweat testing. There's been some really great comparisons by dietitians on these sweat testing devices for different magazines. I really encourage
I read Kylie's one, and was it outside?
Really and we kind of talked a lot about what those devices look like and what the pros and cons are to each of them. Some will measure overall electrolyte loss and some will look at specifically sodium. So I like as a practitioner prefer the ones that look specifically at sodium concentration, but I can also deduce from the overall electrolytes. I just think that that's, again, you're using
confusing for the consumer.
It's very confusing because you don't know what you're looking for. But again, I think some data can be very helpful and some can be too confusing for people. But a lot of these wearable devices are also measuring sweat rate. So you're killing two birds again with one stone when you have a device like that. And it allows you to test in different environments. I will say though that sweat concentration, that sodium concentration shouldn't be changing. So you only need to really be doing it once. So you have to figure out, is it the investment worth it to get a device that tests my sweat rate, but also maybe gives me some idea on my concentration? Or is it that I invest on the concentration and then do the sweat rate testing at home on my own? Because there's worksheets like Precision Hydration. Andy has a great Excel document you can download and plug in all your information, and it helps you keep track of it. Like there's some really great resources on the internet for this stuff. And you can decide what way works best for you. And then there's the Levelin test, which basically you are doing the exercise from wherever you are in the world, collecting that sample and sending it and mailing it in, and they're running it through that precision hydration device to basically tell your concentration and tell you a little bit more about your sweat rate and stuff. And they'll give you basically a breakdown with how to consume those beverages and stuff. So I think that that test will give you a little bit more of a thorough report after your testing, whereas some of the other ones, it's more like real-time reporting. The one thing I will
Wait,
say,
Levelin will give you?
Leveling
Or
gives
you
you
mean,
a pretty thorough report. They'll mail you
yeah.
a report
Yeah,
that
I've seen
tells
it.
you,
Yeah.
the ounces per hour you're losing, the milligrams per hour, and how to kind of incorporate that into your training. It's a great resource. I will
Do you
say,
find it to be accurate?
no, I still
Because
have to do a lot of
I had
tweaking, but it's a great place for people to start.
to start. Yeah, that's what I found, because I got some wacko results
And so
a few times, and then we just had to tweak around with,
this is where I struggle with Levelin, because when you have your athlete doing the testing themselves, there's not as much standardization, and so many things can go wrong. What if your package sits in a facility for 3 to 5 days? I always think about when you're mailing stuff in, or even in the field, if I collect sweat samples and I don't store them properly until I'm ready to test them, evaporation is our biggest problem, because if the water evaporates, your concentration will be higher than what you're truly using. And that's where I think some of the error with leveling comes, is user error. It's not that the test is wrong,
that's what happened.
but 100%
it was like,
it's probably
it was like, I got one that was like 4,000 milligrams or something. It's like, that's insane.
It's either user error or error in the transportation of the samples to the testing facility. There's a lot more chance for error with something like that than honestly, I think precision hydration, because it's real time. I'm right there. I'm doing it. The same thing with the devices. I think the biggest problem with those is that the technology is still growing. And so there's still a lot of errors. I feel like I get a lot of athletes who are just reporting, not that the information is inaccurate, but more that they started a workout and it didn't record it, or it's not picking up the signal, or they're out in the mountains and there's no service, so it stopped collecting data. Like, those are the problems we're seeing right now. But I think that down the line, those will get better, and we're going to see better devices out there, or more improvement in that field. So I think it's more dependent on what a person is looking for. Look at what the variables are that a test is going to tell you. Look at if the cost is going to make sense for you as an athlete. Look at what, resources they're providing you with as well. I think that there's so many different ways to do it, and there's not one wrong way. It's more, what are you looking for, and are you going to get that information from there? I personally am in the camp of, not all data is necessary. Like, too much data is not helpful, honestly, for most people. I would rather have less data and more experimenting. Because at some point you get so much information that you don't know what to do with it. If you keep collecting the sweat rate for every workout, at some point you don't know what to do with that information anymore. So
it's like CGMs. It's like, what we were talking about earlier. It's just like, do you really need all that information? Or can you just be thoughtful about how you compose your meals and the timing of it?
And the more we've learned about CGMs is that it's real time, but there's still, our bodies are always adjusting. And so it may have a lag. That's the biggest thing I've seen with CGMs, is that it's not as accurate, because our blood sugar, especially during exercise, it can't get as accurate as it wants to. The CGM is actually a lot better at rest than it is at exercise. That extra factor plays into it. The more I've been looking at some of the literature and like what people are using right now. And I think that, I honestly think that device is one where I'm like, it's one that athletes typically don't need, unless we're seeing problems with their fueling or bonking constantly, and we can't figure out where it's coming from. It could be hormonal, or it could be, genetic, or any of that stuff.
I have a random question. I know in the Levelin reports, so I'm always thinking about sodium concentration as milligrams per liter, and that's generally how we're referring to it, and you'll see that in like a precision report, for instance. Levelin uses milligrams per hour, and I'm curious why they do that.
I'm not sure. I have to convert all their math to milligrams per liter when I do it. And I
Same.
think it's because, what I'm guessing is, just from understanding, they're speaking to the consumer, and with the
Okay.
athletes that are using it,
Sure.
that's an easier metric, especially because I find that I believe Levelin was created for like triathletes,
Okay.
or was primarily started with triathletes, and so I think that potentially it could be for that. And maybe I'm completely misspeaking on this, and maybe we need to get some of the people from Levelin here to talk about it. But I've always thought that. I've always had to do the math myself to get it
Yeah.
grams per liter, because that's the way that I speak, and that's the way that I
Yeah.
educate.
Same.
But I'm guessing it's because it's easier. I think as a practitioner, we understand that, but as a
Sure.
consumer, it's probably
Well,
a little bit easier to think in
yeah.
hours than it is in liters.
I just think it's so misleading because you can't talk about milligrams per hour if you're not talking about fluid ounces per hour. So actually, the way I talk about it is, we'll determine, okay, what is your milligram per liter goal if we
Mm-hmm.
test it, or if we're roughly estimating
Yeah.
or whatever. And then we figure out their fluid goal, and then we translate it to roughly, we translate it that way. Right. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That one I've always had to convert it myself
Yeah. Okay.
back to
Random
milligrams
questions.
per liter. That's a good one. I guess I never really thought about it, but I think it's more because they create those reports for consumers and for
Sure.
athletes, and it's easier to think
Yeah.
that way as an athlete than it is to think in liters like practitioners do.
Yeah. I have a few more questions. I know
Yeah.
we're already over the hour mark.
All good.
So one thing, you see there's just so much variety in the market when it comes to sports drinks. You have this huge range of carbs and sodium and all these different things. There's it's great that there's something for everyone, but it can be very overwhelming for people to navigate. And, there's some debate also about should you get carbs in your sports drink, or should you keep it totally separate? And you see, products like Element, which has a ton, or it's I guess more the average amount of sodium and basically zero carbs. And then you have these super high carb products, and just and everywhere in between. So I know some of it is personal preference and everyone has to find something for themselves, but I'm just also wondering if you have other thoughts about this concept of, keeping kind of the calories and the sodium and electrolytes separate, or time and a place, or kind of how you approach that.
I typically say, you should, if you are sweating due to exercise, you should have electrolytes in your bottle. It's not a if this, then that. It should be always electrolytes if you're sweating, because you're always going to be losing and you need to be replacing. The carbs are the part that it's a if and when, and it's typically if you're doing an exercise that's either shorter in time or less in intensity, I'm okay with not consuming carbohydrates if what I call the bookends of your workout are well fueled. So if you're having a good pre fuel and a good post fuel, but you're like, I don't need carbs for my 60-minute, track workout. Okay, great. That's fine. As long as you're doing the before and the after really well, you can do 0 carbohydrates during your workout and still be well fueled. Some people are in the camp of, I want to eat my carbohydrates, and that's great. Do it. I think that's sometimes they're like, it's easier for me to keep track if my carbs and my fluids are very different. I think this comes to more logistics than it does, and it's preference, right? So I find that athletes who struggle with getting enough in typically do better when both are together. So if you're struggling with getting your fuel and your hydration, or you get really tired of chewing, or you're not sure what you should be doing all the time, or you're doing something where you can't get your hands to your nutrition as often, I tend to think that putting them together is much better. But then again, I also think it depends on what you're consuming. And picking a sports drink, there's so much out there. So I always say that there's a couple things that you should be looking for in a sports drink. And I think as a practitioner, I say, obviously, I love working for Scratch and I love Scratch, but we're really realistic that that's not for everybody. And we hope that everyone finds the right thing for them. But I say that you should be paying attention to a few things. First, is the sodium concentration the right one fit for me? So is it the right amount for me? And if not, is it at least what the average is? So that's the first one. The second thing is, does it taste good? If you don't like the taste, don't drink it. It doesn't make it work for you better if you don't like the taste. Find something that you like, a flavor you like, or a method of consumption that you like. It's okay to not drink what everyone else is drinking. Find something that is best for your taste. So if you hate non-nutritive sweeteners like stevia and monk fruit, or you hate
me,
and I think a lot of practitioners are alike in this, or you don't like, food, like dyes in your products, or you don't like X, Y, and Z ingredient that a company uses. Just because everyone else is using it, you don't have to use it. Find what works best for your flavor palette. And there may be things that work at different times. Like for me, if I'm doing shorter exercise, I can tolerate a lot sweeter of a beverage. But if I'm doing longer exercise or it's way hotter, I usually need a lot lighter of a beverage. And so learn your habits. Pick something that tastes good because most of them are fine. And I always say doing a little bit more electrolyte is always safer than doing less. I think that for the most part, people are not completely overdoing it. I will say that I think that Element is on the very high side of electrolytes. One thing I think that people don't realize is that it's 1,000 milligrams if you put it in a liter of fluid.
Yeah, exactly.
If
you're putting like 24 ounces
bottle,
yeah,
you're getting 2,000 milligrams per liter technically, and that's a lot. So pay attention to what you're drinking and make sure that it meets what your needs are and that it tastes good. Those are the two things that you should be looking for in your sports drink. And is it in your price range and easily available to where you need it to be? Can you find it easily? Like those are the things you should be looking for. There's not one brand, honestly, in my opinion, that is better than the other. I think it's more a preference thing and what you're looking for as a consumer. Everyone's looking for something different.
Totally. And I think it's, even though, yes, sometimes, you can go on the feed or wherever you go to get your stuff and it's just like, oh my God, there's so many things available. Where do I start? I often tell people, hey, use your sodium needs and fluid needs. Like if you're extremely salty or heavy sweater or whatever, and like your preferred mode of getting things as a way to really narrow it down.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of products out there that are like crazy. Like I don't even know why the sports drink would have such a low sodium content, and that like I often can just knock out like half the field just looking at what someone needs. So you can use that as kind of like a way, like a guiding light to just look through stuff. And then I always tell people too, like it's great to have a stable of different products because a lot of people are training for different things in different weather, different times of the year. And, maybe they're not using it for a race, but they enjoy it in a different, so it's just nice to have options.
I always say build up your pantry, have options, make sure that you pick products that can be flexible. If you don't want to have a ton of stuff, find stuff that you can use in different amounts with different concentrations. And I find that like, to be honest with Scratch, that's kind of where we're moving towards, is that everything is really easy to customize because we know that some people are doing short workouts or, in the winter, you're doing certain types of activities. In the summer, you're doing different ones, but you don't want to have, 50 different things in the pantry. And some people do like it. And so it's really dependent. Find the stuff that meets your needs and can be flexible too is always a win. The other thing I always tell people is that you can be a brand loyalist, but you don't have to be brand exclusive. That's one of the biggest things because I think with people, especially in the endurance sports, you have to consume so much nutrition and hydration that you need variety. And it's important for your gut to be able to take variety. Pick up something from a gas station, pick up something from REI the next time you're there, or, even a drugstore or anything, try some different
Yeah.
stuff. Even gas station foods and drinks, like you should have a little bit of variety because it's better for your body. But you can you can still love a brand, be super brand loyal, and once in a while have a different product. I'm no stranger to that. I will say I grew up with Gatorade being a nostalgic drink. I'm not gonna say I drink Gatorade all the time, but once in a while you just crave a great Gatorade. And it's my favorite thing at Scratch is to catch people drinking other products and taking pictures of them. And it's my cocktail book.
That's great. I love that.
Which is, it's funny. It's a joke because I think truly, like,
Yeah.
people get really serious about this stuff. And I think that we're so grateful that we have such brand loyalists. But I think as an athlete, my best advice is to experiment, try a bunch of different stuff, find stuff that meets your needs, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah. My last question, just because, I mean, it's only early March and we're recording early March, but we will soon be in warmer weather, hopefully. And I'm curious if you work with any athletes doing like really extreme temperature things, like whether it's like something like bad water or triathlons in really hot conditions. And oh, yes, you do. So
yeah,
other than like hyperhydration and, you know, really going into the event well hydrated and dialing in kind of your needs and figuring that piece out, especially for things at the extreme end, what kinds of strategies during an event are you really focusing on, to whether it's like cooling, like I guess not like cool, I'm not talking about like cooling vests or whatever, but like are there specific other like fueling strategies you're doing to keep them hydrated beyond anything other than what we've already talked about?
One big thing that we always recommend to people, especially if you're doing more of the trail running or cycling events that you're out there in, you know, a non honestly road environment, is what I always think about. But cooling methods that are not nutrition related, if you find a creek or a body of water and you're overheated, put your body in that body of water. It makes such a big difference for people finding ways to cool yourself. Also, if you stop at aid stations, even if you have all your nutrition, if they have water and you can dump it on yourself, also a win for most people. But a lot of times what I recommend is if someone is extremely dehydrated, or someone who sweats a lot and knows that they may be in a high heat environment, bring something that will be extremely salty. So like a hydration drink that is maybe double at least what you typically sweat. So we have, or we had until we recently discontinued our Scratch hyperhydration. We're replacing our more specialized sodium products to a new product that we'll be launching at the end of March. So if you're listening now, by the end of March, we should have a new product that allows you to personalize your hydration a little bit better. But I will say extremely salty stuff. So you could use something like an Element, or there's a company called The Right Stuff, or some other products that are more on the very salty end. So 1,500 milligrams or more of sodium. You can use something like that as a rescue hydration in a sense, if you are extremely dehydrated in those cases. And that really works well. If you're overheated as well, your nutrition is not going to go down as easily. I always tell people, if you're in really hot temps, typically liquid or semi-solid nutrition is going to be a lot easier to take down. So you shouldn't probably be eating a bar or like something that's a whole food, but maybe you're eating chews or a gel or like a liquid calorie drink. Those tend to do a lot better in the high heat environments. So even the mode of which you are fueling and hydrating may change dependent on the temperature. So in cooler temps, you can get a lot more solid food down and digestion is a lot easier. But when it's too hot and your core body temperature is hot, your body is not going to accept that. And you're going to feel super nauseous and you're going to feel like there's concrete in your stomach. So avoid doing that kind of stuff. Finding some stuff that you tolerate better in the heat is going to always be great. Cold temperatured foods. If you have a crew for you or any of that stuff is always really nice. Alan is known for his pantyhose ice socks we make. So we take
what is
old
this?
pantyhose, fill it with ice, and you can stuff it basically anywhere you need. The good thing about pantyhose is that it weighs virtually nothing and can be stuffed anywhere and you don't even notice it. So it's a really nice one to kind of have so you're not carrying around extra equipment. But find ways to cool your body down. Sit in the shade if you have to. Pushing through heat and heat exhaustion is not going to help you finish. Cooling your body down, that 5 minutes you take to cool your body down will actually improve your performance better than trying to push through the heat. Is some of the biggest advice. It's not always hydration and fueling related. It's
totally.
Take care of your body and it will let you continue to do the things that you want to do.
Yeah. I did the Canyons endurance runs in last April, and it was like low 90s or whatever it was, and it was just so hot relative to what we were used to. And I just remember stuffing ice down my sports bra. I was just like, this is amazing.
It's the best feeling when it's so hot.
Well, thanks, Colette. I'm just going to wrap up with some quick bites questions. So we'll do favorite pre-workout meal or snack.
I love a Rice Krispie treat as a snack.
Nice.
That's usually my go-to. Or if it's a meal, it's usually something rice-based. So
awesome.
Like a rice bowl or some sort of ricey food.
Got it. What about after a workout?
Oh, I think you froze.
Oh,
Claire.
Sorry. Do you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Oh, yay. What about after a workout?
Typically, I want either a smoothie or a chocolate milk. Those are my two post. And if it's cold, scratch recovery, but as I'll put it in my coffee or like hot water and drink it warm. So if it's on the hotter temps, I usually want either a chocolate milk or a smoothie. And if it is cold, then I usually like my scratch recovery in a coffee.
Well, I have a question for you about that product. Why is the protein not higher?
Because it was made to be an endurance recovery replacement. We found that we found that most products are very protein heavy. And we wanted a product that was going to focus on mainly replenishing glycogen because we knew that most of our athletes are going to eat a meal anyways, even if they have a recovery drink after their workout, and they'll be able to accept more nutrition through a whole food of protein. So it's just enough to get you started on your recovery, but not enough to probably help. Some of my athletes who want a little bit more and they know they maybe don't have access to whole foods, I usually recommend adding a scoop of whatever your favorite protein powder is on those days and customizing it yourself. But also because we don't add supplements into our products, all of our products are food nutrition facts labels. We can't add whey protein. And so all the protein is coming from the dairy that we use in the product.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I figured it was something like that, but I was always kind of curious. I was like, oh, I should ask Colette about that.
Yeah. But also definitely for longer exercise, glycogen replacement is our priority.
Totally.
Typically.
And not enough products focus on that. So and actually I have some clients who use your product during endurance workouts, so like whether it's like an ultra run or something like that.
Exactly. It allows you to be a little bit more flexible with the lower protein.
Yeah. What is the most exotic or interesting food that you've ever tried?
I would say when I was a kid, I'm Middle Eastern, so we eat a lot of organ meat, and I tried goat balls, and that was one I didn't know until after I ate that's what I ate. But it wasn't bad.
There you go. That's a great answer. How do you like your eggs cooked if you eat eggs?
I either like them soft boiled, so like a 7-minute egg, or over easy.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Colette. Can't wait to see what products you guys come out with later this month. Have to sample them.
Yeah, end of March. Keep your eyes out. It's going to be something that I think was definitely missing from our lineup. So we're really excited to launch that for everybody.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Talk soon.
Thanks. Bye, Claire.
That's our show for today. I hope you all enjoyed my chat with Colette. And if you did, please be sure that you're following my show wherever you are listening to your podcast. And if you have a minute, please rate and review my show to help me grow my audience. I'd really appreciate it. If you're able to support the show financially, I do have a Patreon page. I'd love to see you over there. Patreon members get some great perks, including free merch, huge discounts on my digital downloads, and a lot more. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, please feel free to email me, Claire at Eat for Endurance, with any feedback, questions, or topic requests. All right, see you guys next time.